Hello everybody, this is EmmaBurnett from Bradness Gallery. It's the 12th of May 2020, so we're in coronavirus lockdown. And Mike and I wanted to do some little videos for you to hopefully give you some information and help you to carry on with painting while our courses aren't online. So I thought a good place to start might be actually just to go through some of the basics on materials, because the usefulness of having this on video is that you can go back, and if you've forgotten, you can go back and recheck it. So we're going to start with brushes, and I'm going to talk this afternoon about watercolour. At the end of the talking, I'm going to do some little demonstrations on different ways of using the brushes. So there are basically two types of watercolour brush. One is sable, which is a natural fibre, and they are much more expensive, considered to be better. And the others are nylon. The advantage of the nylon is that they're cheaper and they're vegan, which is good for people who are worried about that. So with the nylon brushes, the nylon fibre doesn't hold as much paint as the natural fibre. So you run out of paint quicker as you're painting. With the sable brushes, they come in different sizes and different shapes. Brushes come in an amazing assortment of shapes and sizes. But for a general watercolour painting, these would be the brushes that you would want. On the brush, it tells you what size it is. That number, the number 8, is the size of the brush. So in sable, this is an 8, this is a 4, and this is a 1. And in my opinion, those are the 3 brushes to have. Together with this brush, which is a rigger. I'll tell you about this one in a minute. So the sable brushes hold a lot of paint and they're softer to work with. Very lovely. And I like this make, Pro Arte Renaissance Sable. The rigger brush, you will see, is longer than the regular brush. That means it's very good for doing lovely loose lines, and I'll demonstrate those later. So those are the brushes that I think are good for watercolour painting. Now, the next thing to look at is paper. So watercolour paper comes in different weights, and the weight indicates the heaviness of the paper. Most watercolour paper is 300 grams, and that would be a good weight. A paper sketch pad might be 100, 150 grams, something like that. But 300 grams is standard watercolour paper. I use the Fabriano Artistico paper, which is 640 grams, and that's much more like card. It's thick and really good. And if you're using, if you're doing a standard sort of painting, you don't really have to stretch it. Now on Mike's little video that he's going to do on materials, Mike is going to tell you how to stretch watercolour paper. The reason for stretching paper is that once you apply water to paper in the form of your paints, you can get that slight crinkling, which when you put it in a frame doesn't look good and doesn't look professional. So you can't stretch it after you've worked, you can only stretch it before. For what we do, where we don't saturate the paper, this 640 gram paper is more expensive, but it means that you don't have to stretch it. So paper comes in different surfaces, and the first one we're going to look at, you probably can't see, I'm just going to have to describe it, is called hot pressed. And hot pressed is completely smooth. It's been hot pressed to make it smooth. This is definitely used for people who do precision drawings and things like botanical illustration that's very precise. I use it, I like it. It doesn't matter, you don't have to do precise paintings on it. You can do perfectly loose paintings on it. But then the next paper is called Not, N-O-T, and that is not hot pressed, but you just call it Not. So it hasn't been hot pressed flat, and it's just got a slight bobbly texture to it. And that gives a slightly looser feel to your painting. The third type is rough, which takes that to a slightly another level where it is rougher. And handmade papers are generally quite rough. So those are your papers. The next thing to look at is paints. Now, paints have an amazing amount of information on them. So you might or might not be aware that whatever paints you use and whatever make you use, generally speaking, they make two different qualities. They make a student quality and an artist quality. And really, it's better to use the artist quality. It's better to use the best materials that you can, but shop around online and try and get them at the best price possible. Now, they don't all, different makes use different words for versions of student quality and artist quality. So, for example, in Winsor & Newton paints, the artist quality paint says professional, and the student quality is called Cotman watercolour. So you need to look that up online for each make of paint that you might buy. So some, for example, are in the Graham paints. It's called artist quality, and different paints have different words for that. On the paint tube, there is a lot of information. And again, if you just go online to the paint company, so for example, Winsor & Newton, and look at the symbols. So when you buy a tube of paint, this will be the swatch. So that is telling you the colour that's in the tube. And on the front, this one says Viridian. That's the name of the colour. And that name might cross over from oil paints to different makes of paints. Viridian is a name of a colour, and it indicates the pigments in there. So that's the swatch and the name. You've then got on there a series, and this is series 3, and that simply indicates the price of the paint, because the expensive factor in paints is the pigment, and some pigments are cheaper and in more abundance, and some pigments are very rare. So in days gone by, people did battle over paints. For example, blue lapis lazuli was just so sought after that the people used to take it off the ships before it could go on to other artists, so other artists couldn't use it. And so they had exclusive rights to the blues. And I think some of the old paints were very beautiful in colour. So if it's a cheap pigment, it's series 1, and if it's a very expensive pigment, it's series 5. You might also get a colour that says hue, H-U-E. So it might say a colour like Payne's Grey, but it might say Payne's Grey hue. Now, some people think that hue means that it's of a lesser quality, and that's not necessarily true. So the original colours have the name, and the hue is a more modern chemical version of that. But in some cases, it might actually make a better colour and a more permanent colour, because the original colour could have been made out of bison's urine, and in today's world of mass production, that's not something we want to use. But if that colour had a name and we've recreated it chemically, it will have hue after it. So you again need to look that up individually to see whether it's a lesser colour or a better colour if it says hue. It just means it's a modern chemical version. Now you may notice that some colours are more what is called fugitive. So I'm looking here at all my recipe books in the kitchen, and the sun shines directly on those. And lots of the pinky orange colours especially, the books in general have faded a bit to blue. So you will also see a permanence on there. And on this tube it says permanence AA. And AA is the top that will last. That colour should stay. And A is a bit less permanent and B is even less permanent. So sometimes the pinky reds especially are more fugitive and not likely to last. But generally speaking, artist quality paints last much better than student quality paints, and that's why you pay a bit more for them, because when you've done your beautiful painting you don't want it to have faded in a couple of years' time. You would never on that point put an original painting in sunshine, especially a watercolour painting. So another symbol that's on here is opacity, and that's a little square symbol, and if it's blocked in a black square it's solid and opaque. If it's a clear square it's not, it's more translucent, and if it's half and half it's somewhere in between. And some colours are just more solid and opaque. That's watercolours. Different makes just have different symbols, so you just have to look that up. We think probably Winsor & Newton are the best paints. I quite like these QOR watercolours, and the Schminky I also like. One thing I wanted to show you that's really important. Artists' paints are very expensive. And if you imagine your paint tube is a little bit like a tube of super glue, some of my paints, because we use them here on courses, people aren't used to squeezing them out and they don't squeeze them out very well. So if you can see this one, there's a lot of paint stuck around the tube, and that can mean it sticks like glue and you can't get the top off. So when you squeeze paint from a tube, squeeze it just a tiny bit, not even a pea size. Squeeze it and push onto the plate so that you've left a clean edge, and then put the top on. If you've got like toothpaste, a great ooze of paint sticking out when you put the lid on, then it's going to stick like super glue and then you can't get it open. So that's a really useful thing to learn.